Hello, and welcome back to the Sailing Technical Channel, where we explore the engineering behind sailing. My name is Rory. I'm a lifelong sailor and a retired mechanical engineer. This channel explains the technical aspects of sailing, the forces every sailor experiences but are rarely explained. This is the third episode in the heavy weather series and the first focused on waves. In this episode, we'll begin to understand the power and effects of waves and we'll examine the relationship between wave height, wavelength, and the impact on human tolerance through accelerations and rolling. By now, you know I'm not offering seamanship advice. If you've seen the first two episodes on wind, you know this channel is aimed at roughly a grade 12 physics level. I've tried to keep the explanations clear, but these episodes are more educational than entertaining. However, if you do stick around, you'll gain a far better understanding of why things go wrong in heavy weather than the average sailor. As you can see, I've listed the upcoming episodes, so if you want to see them, please press like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you'll be notified when they're released. And with that, let's get started. Judging wave height and length. One common mistake made by sailors is overestimating wave height. Looking at the image in the lower left, it's easy to see why. A sailor in a small boat has few visual references to accurately judge wave height. If you search the internet for videos of large waves, you'll find countless clips of ships smashing into seas. However, most of those videos are filmed aboard ships, and from that perspective, it's equally difficult to judge wave scale accurately. The next clip shows a French frigate operating in heavy weather. It's one of the few examples I found where we can estimate wave characteristics with some confidence. This frigate is approximately 400 feet long and draws about 20 feet. I'll play this clip now as you watch try to estimate the wave height and wavelength. I should caution you, this is a trick question and you won't have very long to make those judgments. So let's roll this clip now. This fared up wave development curves. Well, that wasn't so easy, was it? Before we continue, imagine yourself sitting on a beach in Thailand on December 26, 2004. If you were there that morning, you would have seen the ocean suddenly recede, with likely no idea it was the warning sign of a tsunami that killed over 100,000 people across Southeast Asia that morning. Today, that knowledge is widespread, and it's likely now such a loss of life would be significantly reduced. If there's one reason I created this channel, it is this: the lack of understanding of how waves develop. Each year, a comparable number of people, in the order of 100,000, drown worldwide. I believe a basic understanding of these wave development principles would reduce that number. If you own a boat, whether a canoe on a lake or a vessel offshore, you carry the responsibility for your passengers. Understanding these graphs will help you manage those risks. These curves were developed by the Norwegian oceanographer Harald Sverdrup. They show how waves develop based on three key factors: wind speed, wind duration, and fetch, the distance wind blows over water. Each of these can limit wave development. Now, let's get the overview. You'll notice that both graphs have time in hours on their horizontal axis. The graph on the right shows wave height measured in feet. The graph on the left shows wave length, also measured in feet. Note the difference between the heavy dark curves. On the wave height graph, wave height increases very rapidly when the wind begins to blow, but then the curves flatten out. Wave height reaches the limiting value after about 12 hours and then only increases marginally over time. On the left graph, wavelength also develops quickly at first, but continues upward at roughly a 45-degree slope. This tells us that the wavelength keeps increasing over time, even after wave height is largely stabilized. These graphs form a key component of this session, and we'll return to them several times to see how they played out in real events, some of them tragic. I first came across them in Marhai's book, Sailing Theory and Practice. Perplexingly, they are not widely available in this graphical form. They do appear in Heavy Weather Sailing, written by Peter Bruce, and published by Adler & Coles, which is considered a Bible on the subject, but only there in tabular format. I believe the graphical form here leaves a more intuitive impression of how waves actually develop. The takeaway for these graphs: early in the storm, On the open ocean with unrestricted fetch, the initial seas in a storm will have short wavelengths and steep faces, but later the waves will develop into longer, more organized swells. Also, wave size, both height and length, develop very quickly when the wind starts to blow. That's why small craft are often caught off guard by sudden storms. Also, in restricted waters such as lakes and rivers, fetch limits wave growth. This results in short wavelengths compared with relatively large wave heights. The short, steep seas on lakes and rivers can be just as dangerous as those found in the open ocean, but are often underestimated. If you haven't grasped these curves just yet, we'll be coming back to them with practical examples during the session, and will make their implications very clear. Let's go to the next slide. Slide 4, estimating the wave lengths and height from the frigate footage. Now with that background, let's return to the images of the frigate to determine the wave height and wavelength. In the two upper images, notice the ship is heading into the seas at a slight angle. In the upper left image, a wave crest is amidships, the bow is lifted, and the stern propellers are nearly exiting the water. In the upper right image, the frigate's bow is now plunging into the crest, and the stern is immersed in the following wave. From this, we can infer the wave height is on the order of 40 feet, roughly twice the ship's draft, and the wavelength is comparable to the ship's length, about 400 feet. But in the bottom image, the frigate is turned around and is running with the seas. Notice that the waves are materially elongated. By comparing the distance between the crest to the known length of the ship, we can estimate the wavelength here is closer to 1,000 feet. On the next slide, we'll return to the waves graphs and see how wavelength determined when the captain could turn his ship around. Slide 5, Captain's Decision. On this slide, I've marked a green block labeled FF1, which I believe represents the conditions during the upper two photographs. At FF1, wind speed was likely 40 to 50 knots, fetch was effectively unrestricted, wavelength was approximately 400 feet, and wave height was about 20 feet. Most sailors intuitively understand that short, steep seas are dangerous, particularly because they increase the risk of capsize. The right-hand graph shows that the wave height would have built to about 40 feet within about 24 hours, and then more or less remained at that height. It appears that our captain delayed turning his ship around until the wavelengths had increased from about 400 feet to about 1,000 feet in the FF2 position. Now, very few of us are ever going to drive ships in heavy storms, but a retired admiral friend of mine confirmed that this is exactly what he would have done. You do not expose a ship broadside to short period seas. One can only execute a turn after the seas have elongated, and even then, the maneuver must be done very carefully. Next slide, please. Lake Tahoe tragedy, June 2025. Now that you understand how quickly steep waves form, you're probably better able to appreciate why boaters can underestimate dangerous sea conditions. In June 2025, 8 family members set out on Lake Tahoe on a calm early summer day. They stopped in Emerald Bay on the southwest corner of the lake, but a sudden snow squall with strong northerly winds developed. The boat attempted to head north towards home and then returned to Emerald Bay for shelter. However, lacking cold weather gear, they again attempted the northward crossing, this time directly into large waves. The winds are reportedly 30 to 40 knots, and the fetch on Lake Tahoe is about 22 miles. Returning to the wave graphs, within an hour or so, the wave lengths would have developed to about 60 feet and the wave heights about 6 feet. These short, steep seas would have been extremely dangerous for a 28-foot open bow rider powerboat. It's likely the waves flooded the open bow, and it would only take a couple to overwhelm the bilge pumps, and perhaps the engine flooded and died, or there's just so much water on board sloshing around the boat became uncontrollable. Witnesses on shore reported the boat turned broadside to the waves and capsized, only about 100 yards from land. All 8 souls on board died. Next slide. Fetch-controlled waves in inland waters. Now let's discuss wave formation on inland waters where fetch, the distance where the wind blows across water, is the dominant factor controlling wave size. For many years, I kept my boat on the St. Lawrence River at Kingston, sailing frequently on Lake Ontario. I made the passage several times shown by the red dotted line from Oswego, New York to Maine Duck Island. This area has about 200 miles of fetch, measured to the western end of Lake Ontario. By contrast, I now sail primarily on the Ottawa River. For my club, the effective open water fetch in a northwesterly wind is only about 10 miles. The upper right image is a Navionics screenshot of this area. I adjusted the settings for conditions that occur during the high water periods in spring and fall, so the wave base is not depth limited. With that, let's return to the Sverdrup curves on the next slide to determine the likely wave conditions that would develop in 30 knots of wind, likely the maximum wind speed any of us would choose to go out on. Comparing fetch-restricted waves at 30 knots. Now let's quantify the wave characteristics using the Sverdrup curves. In 30 knots of wind, as that is likely the maximum any of us would want to be out there. Using the full Lake Ontario fetch, marked by the red boxes, we obtain a wave length of approximately 270 feet and a wave height of about 17 feet. Now compare that to Lake Duchesne and the Ottawa River, where the fetch for a northwesterly wind is about 10 miles. The wave length, roughly 50 feet, the wave height, approximately 5 feet. Shorter waves mean steeper and more punishing conditions. The closer the wave length becomes to the hull length, the more uncomfortable your passage will become, because it induces rapid and repeated vertical accelerations. Now, don't get me wrong, in 30 knots of wind, being on a 35-foot boat on Lake Ontario was no picnic, but it was less upsetting to the gut and less stressful than sailing my current 28-foot boat in 50-foot wavelengths. Next slide, please. Alternative wave interpretation charts. In order to do further analysis and better understand the effects of waves on boats and crews, we need an appreciation of some additional factors, including wave velocity, period, the time it takes for one wave to pass, and the new parameter of steepness ratio. Let's examine some more graphs for interpreting wave characteristics. We'll start with the graph on the right. Wave characteristics are governed by mathematical equations. We could calculate the interdependent variables of wave length, velocity, and period, or we can simply use this graph. If we focus first on the wavelength of 50 feet for Lake Duchesne on the Ottawa River, shown with the blue dotted line, we see from the curve the wave velocity is about 9 knots, with a corresponding period of approximately 3.2 seconds. Now, let's shift our attention to the wavelength of approximately 270 feet for eastern Lake Ontario. Here, we get a wave velocity of about 22 knots and a period of roughly 7.5 seconds. With that tucked away in our minds, now let's look at the graph on the left. This graph solves the problem of identifying wave characteristics like we had to do with the frigate footage. It is probably best to use this with a developed sea when you want to record the wave characteristics. I've included it here for general information purposes. Sailors will find it easier to use because it combines wave height, wave length, steepness ratio, wave speed, and wind speed. Now, let's suppose you're at sea and observe a 50-footer that's hull is roughly 1/4 of the distance between the wave crests. That enables you to establish the wavelengths are about 200 feet. Now, using this chart and going up from the 200-foot wavelength with a green dotted line, we can estimate the probable wave state of a wave period of about 6 seconds, of wave velocity of about 18 knots, a steepness ratio of about 1 in 16, wave heights of about 12 feet, and wind speeds near 16 knots. And with that, we'll go to the next slide. Wave steepness and encounter frequency. Now we're going to do some analysis for the 30-knot wind blowing over the 10-mile and 200-mile fetch areas. So let's assemble the data. For 200 miles, the wavelength is 270 feet, the wave height 17 feet, the wave period 7.5 seconds, and the wave speed is it's traveling at 22 knots at 37 feet per second. And for 10 miles, that's 50 feet wavelength, a 5-foot wave height, and a wave period of 3.2 seconds. And that wave is traveling at 9 knots or 15 feet per second. Also, now let's introduce steepness ratio, and which we obtain by ratioing the wave height by the wave length. For a 200-mile fetch, the steepness ratio is approximately 1 to 16. And for a 10-mile fetch, the steepness ratio is about 1 in 10. Now we can better appreciate that for boats operating in short fetches are often subject to steeper waves. So we know that if we are stationary in Lake Duchesne with a 10-mile fetch and 30 knots of wind, every 3.2 seconds our boat would rise and fall 5 feet. However, we are normally underway, and how waves affect us depend on whether we are traveling into or away from them. This effect is best represented by the time of encounter our boats have with each wave. The time of encounter is calculated by dividing the wavelength by the relative speed of approach, which is equal to the wave speed, which is known as celerity, plus or minus the boat speed. Now let's assume we are punching into a head sea on a 10-mile fetch and we are managing to make 2 knots or 3.3 feet per second boat speed, which would be challenging in these conditions. The wave speed, 9 knots or 15 feet per second, a wave length, 50 feet. Plugging the numbers in and adding the wave and boat speeds, the encounter time drops to about 2.7 seconds. That means for each passing wave, the boat rises for about 1.5 seconds and falls for 1.5 seconds. And that is repeated relentlessly. This produces grueling vertical accelerations. Now consider sailing downwind in the same 5-foot seas with your hull speed of 7 knots or 11.8 feet per second, using the same wavelength of 50 feet as the numerator, but now subtracting the hull speed of 7 knots or 11.8 feet per second from the wave speed of 15 feet per second. The encounter time stretches to about every 16 seconds as the boat is slowly overtaken by successive waves. This explains something that sailors already know. Sailing upwind in strong winds and steep seas is exhausting and punishing. Sailing downwind in the same conditions is often pleasant, and waves slowly overtake the boat. This math simply confirms the lived experience. Next slide, please. Vertical accelerations, G-forces, slamming, and crew incapacitation. About 40 years ago, I started a race in our family's 25-foot sailboat on Lake Duchesne. The wind had been blowing 25 to 30 knots over a 10-mile fetch for several days, producing conditions consistent with what we've described. Wave height about 5 feet, wave length about 50 feet. Period about 3.2 seconds. I was sailing with one crew member under storm jib and reefed main. The motion was brutal because of the vertical accelerations. Vertical acceleration is governed by the equation. Acceleration max is equal to amplitude times 2 pi divided by the wave period t squared. Where wave amplitude is half the wave height, the 2 pi represents one complete oscillation cycle. But note the dominant variable is t, the wave period. Because it is squared, acceleration varies inversely with the square of the period. So as the periods shorten, accelerations rise dramatically. At the crest, acceleration is downward and we'll feel lighter. In the trough, acceleration is upward and we feel heavier. To express this in G-forces, we divide by gravity of 32.2 feet per second or 9.8 meters per second squared in SI units. If we were in a long swell in Lake Ontario, say 17-foot waves with a 7.5 second period, we experience about a plus or minus 0.19 G, about 20% lighter at the crest and about 20% heavier in the trough. That's the yellow point shown on the chart. But on that day, in those 5-foot Lake Duchesne waves at 3.2 seconds period, we experienced roughly a plus or minus 0.3 G, shown by the red dot. Our bodies felt 30% lighter in the crests and 30% heavier in the troughs. And as the chart shows, human ability to function depends on both G-force and oscillation period. Now this assumes the boat is stationary. Sailing into waves reduces the encounter period, which increases acceleration further by that same square law relationship. Our velocity made good to windward was perhaps 2 knots, so about every 1.5 seconds the bow would fall off a crest into a trough and climb the next wave. After about 10 minutes, my only crew member became violently seasick and completely incapacitated. I had to abandon the race, but I didn't have enough sea room to bear off and to strike sail safely. I started the engine and crawled forward on hands and knees to take down the headsail. As I reached the bow, I had the sensation of the boat falling away beneath me and weightlessness, and then slamming to a violent stop, with the sense of my weight increasing sharply as the bow dropped into the trough. I remember wondering, did I really just experience 0G? That question was answered later by Marhai and Seaworthiness. Let's look at the schematic in the upper left. Someone seated near the cockpit experiences mainly the cyclical rise and fall of the wave train, but the boat pitches around its center of gravity just forward of the cockpit. For crew members moving forward of that center of gravity, the distance becomes a lever arm that amplifies the vertical acceleration. I won't go into all the calculations, but Marhai showed that at the bow, with a 12-foot lever arm, the crew would be subjected to roughly a plus or minus 1.28 G, shown by the purple arrow, that is well beyond normal human tolerance. And in these conditions, the boat is being beaten up as well. When the bow pitches down into a trough, it is being driven by the rotational inertia of the hull and rig and can strike the water violently. That impact is slamming or pounding. Its severity depends greatly on hull shape. Deep V forward sections re-enter more gradually, flatter sections stop more abruptly and slam harder. The more abruptly pitching is arrested, the greater the impact loads transmitted into the hull. The hull shudders, the structural stresses rise, and the crew's ability to function deteriorates rapidly. For perspective, an elevator typically produces only about 0.1 G. and that sits near the lower malaise threshold on this chart. But elevators don't make us sick because those accelerations are brief and non-recurring. And at sea, they repeat again and again, and that breaks crews down. So, did I experience weightlessness? Likely yes, probably a momentary reduction in near zero effective gravity, transient weightlessness. And it is the same physics, simply scaled up, that incapacitated crews in the 1979 Fastnet race. Many crews abandoned otherwise seaworthy yachts not because the boats had failed, but because incessant vertical accelerations had made them unable to move safely, clip on, reef sails, or assist others. The boat may have been seaworthy, but it's just no longer operable. And we'll go to the next slide, please. Slide 12, wave resonance and loss of stability. In episode 2, we saw how wind vortices can induce forces that, within just a few roll cycles, can lead to a significant loss of stability when they align with the vessel's natural roll period. The same type of instability can also be triggered by wave action. Even modest waves, if their timing matches the boat's natural roll period, progressively amplified rolling motion. This is analogous to pushing a child on a swing. A small, well-timed push, repeated consistently, causes the swing to rise higher and higher. Similarly, even small wave forces, when applied at the right moment, can cause large roll angles. In the diagram from seaworthiness, we see an increasing roll resonance condition from broadside waves. I wasn't able to find a good example involving a sailboat or powerboat in this condition, called synchronous rolling, likely because any attentive skipper would instinctively alter course to interrupt the resonance. However, this clip of a container ship provides a close parallel. In this case, a vessel is experiencing parametric rolling, a phenomenon affecting the ships such as container vessels and car carriers with large bow and stern flare. Here, the roll amplitudes are the result of resonance effects driven by the ship's operating in wavelengths comparable to its hull length. This leads to periodic variations in riding moment, which amplify the roll. The helmsman response is exactly what we would expect, altering course to break the resonance condition and reduce the roll before it escalates further. Next slide, please. Human effectiveness in rolling. We have learned about the effects of vertical acceleration and slamming, both on the crew and on the vessel. This slide, again from Seaworthiness Forgotten Factor, charts human effectiveness on the vertical axis against the angle of roll over prolonged periods. Notice small angles of roll increases effectiveness slightly, which explains why humans find rocking chairs so pleasant. There's a personal element here as well. Thinking back to my few ocean voyages, moderate rolling never bothered me much when trying to sleep. However, on a couple of occasions I had to move out of the V-berth and into the main salon because even small, repeated vertical accelerations, that feeling of your weight increasing and decreasing, made sleep difficult while off watch. Fatigue is a safety issue. In the last episode of this series, we will touch briefly on route planning because sailors today have access to tools that did not exist when many of us started sailing. There are now voyage ocean planning programs that forecast wind and wave conditions, and by inputting your boat type and displacement and hull form, will predict rolling, slamming frequency, and vertical accelerations along a proposed route. Also, if I were preparing for an offshore passage today, I would download some of the smartphone apps that use built-in accelerometers. These will let you measure and record the motions you and your crew experience, pitching, rolling, and vertical accelerations. Doing this beforehand and getting a sense of how your crew and vessel cope on a day sail will better predict how you will fare on a passage. You may find you are comfortable in the aft owner's cabin, where motions are relatively gentle, but the crew sleeping forward may be experiencing vertical accelerations that make sleep difficult. And if people cannot sleep, they cannot recover. Heavy weather risk is often not about one dramatic event. It is about cumulative exposure to accelerations, slamming, rolling, and sleep interruptions. Modern forecasting tools will not eliminate risk, but they will help you make better informed decisions if and when to depart and a course to sail. So in summary, you now have a better understanding of how waves develop and the risks they create and the limits of human tolerance to rolling and acceleration. And for those of you making offshore passengers, you now have some sense of the data behind motion tolerances. Thanks for following along, and with this, we've come to the last slide of episode 3. Closing episode 3. Thank you for sticking around till the end of episode 3. I trust you found this useful. In episode 4, we'll discuss more about mechanics and theory, wave interference, orbital motion, and how waves affect rudder authority. As an engineer, and even in retirement, I've always felt a responsibility towards public safety. What has always surprised me, while wave behavior has been understood for over a century, it is not taught to sailors or boaters. Perhaps that is because, as you are discovering, wind force and wave formations do not follow a progressive or linear paths, and thus this subject is deemed just too complicated to teach. When we hear of those terrible drowning accidents, it is easy to attribute them to poor judgment. Psychology tells us that too often we humans relate error to false attribution, blaming individuals' character rather than gaining the appreciation of what their knowledge base was, on which they unknowingly made what turned out to be a deadly decision. I've made plenty of mistakes on the water myself and have been fortunate. I created this series to help others make better informed decisions. I hope and trust that whoever's the rights holder of this fair curs views their intellectual property the same way I do. They fulfill a public service that should be distributed and understood, not guarded away in a textbook. If this knowledge reaches sailors, race officers, instructors, and regulators, and spreads, then those curves and I will have served our respective purposes. Hopefully, I'll see you around next time in episode 4. Until then, sail safe.